Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Today it's my pleasure to be joined by Meredith Ogilvie-Thompson. Meredith is a journalist and a hugely positive presence on Substack. She writes about a variety of critical issues, and I'm looking forward to a lively and informative discussion. Meredith, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. I want to start with Medicaid cuts because you just wrote an article on the effect of the cuts on Virginia residents and institutions. Talk about that a bit, because it was a great article, and I think it really illuminates what's going on in Virginia and around the country as well.
Thanks so much. I will say that I thought it was really important to dig down and really look at this, especially in the context of there being just so much discourse around whether or not there were any cuts in the first place. So Virginia, just to give some background, was one of the last states to actually adopt the Medicaid extensions. And it took quite a long time. And it was an incredibly bipartisan effort to get there. And so when the cuts were announced in the big, beautiful bill, there was a lot of surprise because there was so much bipartisan effort to get to the expansions in the first place. In Virginia, they came up by law, the state has to have a balanced budget. And so they came up with a way to fund the extensions, and that was a provider tax. And it was interesting to dig down into this because a lot of people wrote to me afterwards and said they had no idea what a provider tax was. But essentially, Virginia, rather than taxing their residents, they got about 63 of the hospitals who agreed to pay what's called a provider tax. And this money was then used to leverage to unlock the federal subsidies for the Medicaid expansion. It's a very, very delicately balanced system. Not only are there cuts to Medicaid I suppose it's a misnomer in a way, there are cuts to the Affordable Care Act's tax subsidy. So that's the first thing that's happening. And that's happening. People are going to see that in November. And that's probably going to kick a lot of people off the platform. Medicaid, what's happening is to me, the federal government has basically said this provider tax has to be stepped down. So that already caps or reduces the amount that the state can unlock. It's then requiring some pretty onerous things for people on Medicaid to do. So instead of verifying your employment once a year, now people have to verify their employment twice a year. And most of the people on Medicaid, a lot of them, certainly in the state of Virginia, are people who are working multiple jobs. Often there's seasonal work, informal work, and having to go back and get everybody to sign off and remember that you worked a certain number of hours, I think is going to be difficult. Also, we have to realize that a lot of people don't have access to the internet. If you're poor, you probably don't have it at home. You might not even have your own laptop. A lot of this is done online. Or if it is mailed to you, a lot of people who are renting are moving a lot. They don't always get their mail. So there is this ability for people who legitimately should qualify for the benefit who will fall through the cracks. And, there's just a lot of different components to this at play. I don't know how much Virginia is differing from other states, but what I do know in reporting it, and I reported it for a paper in Fauquier County, and Fauquier County is in the top 10 wealthiest counties in the country. Keep that in mind. 1 in 7 people in Fauquier County is on Medicaid. Now, if that's happening in Fauquier County, I don't know what's happening in other places that are not
Fairfax
in the top
County,
10 of wealthiest counties.
Yeah,
I don't know. I just a lot of the very wealthy counties in the country are in Virginia, actually. So Virginia actually starts out a bit better than most. But the Joint Economic Commission is basically estimating that this is going to be a $2 billion a year shortfall for the state of Virginia. And there are only so many levers you can pull. You either have to tax people, which nobody wants to do, or you have to make cuts. And that's what's going to happen. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that the way this has all been structured between the initial rollback of the subsidies for affectionately known as Obamacare to the step down of the provider tax and the requirements now for new requirements for Medicaid. These are rolling out mostly after the midterm elections. So, I have to take my hat off. Tactically, it's pretty brilliant. And it's given people cover to be able to say, wait a minute, we haven't cut anything. There are not going to be any cuts. Nothing is changing.
It's a tough situation, and it's replicating itself everywhere. I heard Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky talking about it the other day. It's affecting his state as well, and others. It's a national problem. But to highlight Virginia, I think, is really important because of, as you said, the high per capita income in Virginia and the fact that there's such a dichotomy. It seems like a system that's created for people who don't need Medicaid.
What's interesting to me is I so hesitate to use words like diabolical, but I really do feel like this has been diabolical. It's one thing for the federal government to say, you know what, we're gonna pull back from making, allocating federal dollars to this. But Virginia figured out a way for Virginia to allocate dollars and got hospitals to agree to a provider tax. In my mind, it's extraordinary overreach for the federal government to then come in and say, you have to step that down. Like, why should Virginia step that down when they created the system that worked in the state? It was balanced. So it is really a terrible, terrible thing that's happening. I will say, Mark, just to editorialize, I've covered a lot of really awful stories in my life, and I spent a lot of my career in Africa and have done some more reporting. And I will say that there have been only a handful of times where I have felt so emotionally vexed covering a story. Or this one really got me. I mean, it's going to hurt so many people, a lot of whom are Republican, a lot of whom voted for this administration. It's not going to necessarily, in Fauquier County, the Fauquier Free Clinic, there are a lot of wealthy residents that will just ramp up their giving to support the Fauquier Free Clinic. Where it's really going to hurt are in areas like in Southwest Virginia,
where there are no
really poor areas of Virginia. And they're represented by Republican legislators who really wanted this to come into play in 2018 because their constituents are the ones that were dying.
It's really interesting. This regime, as I like to call it, tends to federalize everything it wants to. Things that give it power. But when it comes to things that cost money and things that cause a burden, they want to dump it off to the states. So it's an interesting form of federalism they've created, and one that I think is going to end up costing them dearly, because a lot of those people who voted for them are now realizing they voted for a pig in a poke.
I think you're right, Mark. But if we want to turn it around to look at the glass half full, and I'm not often a glass half full girl, but I'm going to look at it this way right now, what's been highlighting things for me is we have power at a local level. And when I tune in to what's happening at a federal level, I tend to feel powerless. I don't know how to affect change. But at a local level, and as someone who's always worked for big international publications, I do a lot of freelancing now for my local newspapers. And I spend time at, local board of supervisor meetings and interviewing state delegates and local legislators. And a lot can be affected at a local level. I guess what I would say to anyone tuning in who is also feels a little helpless at the moment is get involved at a local level. It's amazing the sorts of things that the decisions that are taken at a local level that really impact our lives. And I do think that is something we need to fight to preserve.
I think you're absolutely right. I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about Africa. My wife did her graduate work at Emory, and her focus is on on post-conflict reconstruction. And a lot of her work was in
Oh,
Africa, and
wow.
she spent some time traveling in Africa and working there. So it's near and dear to my heart because of by extension, I've learned a lot. Talk to me about your adventures in Africa. What did you see? What affected you the most? What stories did have the same visceral effect as this one does?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I I would say that I moved there. I was young and newly engaged. My now ex-husband was South African, and so I moved to South Africa. It was still apartheid government. I had been brought up in a really liberal household. My father was a broadcast journalist. Um, I grew up in New York City, and off I went. And this was 1992 in South Africa. And I think the thing that struck me the most, and I had traveled in Africa before I met my husband, spent a year there, um, is the impact that you can have as a reporter in Africa, giving a face and a voice to stories that might otherwise not be told. So I think as a journalist, that was really rewarding to feel that a true sense of efficacy in my reporting, that it was really making a difference. But I think the thing, and I've spent time in, let's see, probably like 26 of the 54
Uh,
countries in Africa. So I really have
yeah,
traveled
you
a
have.
lot across the continent and seen a lot. And I think the thing that, there are a few things that make me really love that continent is the innovation and ingenuity. Everywhere I went, people who really came up with solutions because there was nothing and there's no public sector that's providing goods and services in most of the continent, certainly sub-Saharan Africa. And if we think about it, mobile telephony, I mean, that was really catalyzed in Africa and took off in Africa and was much more sophisticated. The networks, in fact, are so much better. I have more dropped calls outside of Washington, D.C. than I do in
Yeah.
Lagos. And I think that Africans also, it's a sense of family and community that really touched me. How people are so willing to help and never really thinking about any personal cost. Just the answer is yes, we'll figure it out. Um, I think there's also really what I learned having grown up in this kind of rarefied world in New York and going to school and university there is at the end of the day, we have so much more in common globally with one another than there are differences. And, things that I worried about as a newlywed or a young mother, I found I could have conversations all over the continent with women who thought about the same things or worried about the same things. I think that Africa is often overlooked in the sense that people who aren't familiar with the continent and how sophisticated a history there is tend to think it is unsophisticated and that there's not a lot to take away. But they're extraordinary artists and writers. And I mean, if you think about the fact that civilizations have been have been going on for thousands of years, I think there's just a lot to learn. I wouldn't know where to stop in terms of telling you the things that in ways that the continent has
And I
touched
can
my life.
understand that. I went there with my wife several times.
Where'd you
Went
go?
to Ghana, went to
Oh, wow. Okay.
Botswana, South Africa,
Hmm.
Zimbabwe, and
Hmm.
I'm missing a few. One of the things that struck me is that despite the tribulations and the travails and the difficulty of life there from a material point of view, how incredibly happy most Africans I met were. They're happy with their lives. They have a
Interesting.
sense of community, as you said. They have a sense of family. And we lack that here. And we're one of the most
I would
unhappy
agree.
countries in the world. We're totally
Isn't it
isolated.
extraordinary?
And yet we have this wealth.
So I'll tell you a funny story. I lived overseas for so much of my adult life, but there was a brief period when my boys were about 2 years old where my husband came back to work on a project in New York for a year. And I hadn't lived in America for a while, and I certainly hadn't spent time here since becoming a new mom. And we arrived and we were renting a house, and we went to the house and left my husband and my kids. And I said, I'm going to just pop out to the grocery store, get groceries. And I came back like 6 hours later. And my husband said to me, what happened to you? This was probably before I had a cell phone. And he said, I was so worried. What happened? And I said, you cannot believe what an American supermarket looks like. I mean, I hadn't really been an adult in America for very long, and I certainly hadn't been in an American supermarket. And I tried explaining to him, I went to get milk and there's like 700 different kinds of milk. I was mesmerized. It was the size of an aircraft hangar, and I just couldn't choose. And that was my initial impression coming back to the States, having not been here for so long. And then the other thing is having lived in a place where I lived in England and in South Africa. So if you ask directions, somebody would say, oh, well, there's an old manse up there, you'll take a left. Or if you're in Africa, maybe it was, you'll get to the baobab tree and take a right. And in America, there's a Walmart, there's a Target, there's a 7-Eleven. Like, our whole frame of reference is so consumer orientated. It's really interesting you say how unhappy we are, but I think that has a lot to do with it. I think we're just frozen in this land of retail.
You can drop somebody in almost any suburb in this country, and you drive down a road and you'll see strip malls, and they all look alike.
Totally.
You don't know where you are.
Yeah, I agree.
Whereas
so
there's
true.
a certain distinctiveness about
true.
Africa where you know where you are, from the topography, from the people, from the culture. It's just so different.
Did you notice a huge difference? Like, I'm thinking even just culturally and personality wise, being in Botswana and South Africa and then going to Ghana. Did you really feel like you were going from country to country? Because so many of Americans think of Africa almost like one big country.
Yes. The differences were vast.
Tell me about that.
It's not that so one country was better than the other. They were just different. The Ghanaians are very happy-go-lucky people. They're a lot of fun. They're very humorous. The Botswanans I found more laid back.
Oh, did you? Interesting.
I found them more laid back, but still very happy. And they were in both places, very curious about America, very curious about what they were missing, what they didn't see. And I said, you have a lot here. You should be very thankful for it. And they agreed with me.
So
they really
true.
were happy where they were. They liked it. And none of them felt the need to immigrate to America. But what I found traveling the world is the most consumer-oriented societies are the ones that want to improve and go to America because they think it'll be a little bit better than what they've got there. Whereas the countries that aren't consumer-oriented and that live happy lives are not in any hurry to emigrate to the United States.
It's so funny you say that when, we've all been reading the same reports about tourism being down. And none of my friends in South Africa, in England, in Europe, having lived so much of my adult life overseas, I really rarely came across people who were dying to go to America or go there on holiday. Like, people went to New York or LA or whatever for work. But when my friends go on holiday, they're either going to Europe or somewhere, in Europe for summer holidays, or my friends in South Africa will drive up and go camping in the bush for a few weeks or whatever. It's really interesting that I never came across people who really wanted to have holidays in the States. I think we have a very inflated sense of our own fabulousness.
We do, and right now,
in a lot of ways.
Very few people want to come here. And it's hard to blame them.
Well,
Some of us want to leave. Let me switch gears a bit and talk about the media. I mean, you've been in the media for quite some time. What's happening here? What's your theory as to what is going on?
Oh gosh, I think a few things are going on. I think I have to go back to my first job was at Time Magazine, and it was right after the Time Warner merger. And it was around that time as well. I can't remember the exact date that CNN started, but My father was like a crusty old newsman, and I remember him saying to me that everything was about to change, and he really wished that I wasn't going to work in the media. And I think that was the beginning of the end in some ways. You and I are probably, I know I'm old enough, you're old enough to remember there were three networks. And my father worked for CBS. This will make you laugh. And people used to say to me, friends, parents of friends of mine when I was growing up, "Oh, we love your father, dear. He's so wonderful, but we don't watch CBS. It's too liberal. It's too liberal." The impression when I was growing up is that CBS was the liberal network. But here's the thing. If you went to a dinner party, if you watched the 6 o'clock news and then went out to a dinner party, you might argue about what was going on, but you didn't argue about the facts. You didn't argue if all three networks in those 27 minutes or whatever reported the same things. They might have reported them in a different way in terms of one led with something
But
and the other didn't.
There was no dispute about what was
but
factual.
The facts, there wasn't any dispute. And so the truth, I mean, you and I have talked about this. Facts are specific, verifiable pieces of information. The truth is broader and more complex. That's where the spin comes in. Journalism started kind of veering off the rails, I think, when sadly, it's not about the facts anymore. And when it went from this prescribed format of reporting in these 20-something minutes every night to 24/7 news, I think that's when the changes came in. You can't just report the facts on a loop for 24 hours. You have to figure out ways to satisfy your advertisers, get more eyeballs, and make money. And it is entertainment. There's no doubt about it. And I think, well, I haven't watched like cable news or anything probably since the last Trump administration. I can't watch it anymore. I think I think the next thing that happened, I think that was the beginning of a decline. And really when things became sensationalist, opinion driven, these talk shows, endless opinions without really giving a disclaimer, like 6 o'clock show is an opinion show, so people became, I think, desensitized to this format and began to think that everything that came out of Anderson Cooper's mouth was a fact, or I don't even know the Fox network host.
But then Fox is guiltier than everybody.
Well, I think by design. I don't think they make any bones about that. I mean, that's Rupert Murdoch's formula. How we have never challenged their license, their news license. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer.
Democrats
Maybe you can weigh in and answer that.
Republicans have no desire to do it.
Okay, well, there's your answer. I think the next real knockout blow to journalism, which I don't even know what that is anymore, was Section 230. So you had 24-hour news and then social media, and it gave them cover. They didn't have to be responsible for anything that was on their platform. So you can say anything you want and no one is going to take it down or challenge it. It becomes he said, she said. And until Elon Musk took over Twitter, a lot of people like me, a lot of journalists were on Twitter. And I would often go to Twitter to look for breaking news, like Tahrir Square was broken on Twitter, things that were happening internationally. And I think, again, the general public got sort of sensitized to sourcing your news from places like this, where there's no fact checking. So, yeah, I think it's been a slide. I don't think it's all happening with this administration.
It's funny on CNN, and in particular, before I stopped watching them, they had George Conway on quite a bit, and they also had a guy named Scott Jennings and another guy named David Urban. Both of them were Trump blacks. Well, Conway lost his temper at Jennings because Jennings was just saying stuff that wasn't true. And they chastised Conway for taking him on, saying that it wasn't really appropriate to challenge a colleague like that. So basically, they defended the Trump liar and tossed the other guy. He stopped coming on. So it tells you a little bit about what's going on. I mean, the corporate masters have really stepped in and said, we want it this way because we have interests and we want to protect them and we don't want to antagonize the Trump administration. That's not news gathering anymore. That's not news delivering anymore. That's just propaganda. Um,
Yeah, no, I get that. I think that this whole idea of both sidesism
yeah.
as well. I mean, I bump up against it in the outlets that I freelance for a lot now are nonprofit news organizations. So I can't even blame a corporate overlord. I have great editors who will have the conversation with me. But for example, you were kind enough not to mention in the Medicaid story, I didn't have an interview with a Republican delegate. I tried. And what I was told in writing, and it happened in other stories too, including a piece I did on cuts to the National Endowment for Humanities, is I would ask about how these cuts were going to affect Virginians, and I would be told there are no cuts. Nothing is going to change. This is all fake news. And my editor said to me on the Medicaid story, you know, Meredith, what about having a Republican delegate give an opinion? I'm sure they would have a different opinion. And I said, take my name off the piece and run it as your own. And he said, whoa, 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 what do you mean? And I said, because I don't want to give a platform to lies. I don't have a problem running opinions that I don't agree with. I mean, that's my job. But I can't give a platform to somebody saying it's raining outside. You know, if somebody says it's raining outside and somebody else says it's sunny, my job isn't to say there's an argument about the weather. My job is to go outside and tell you, is it sunny or is it raining? And so I think we've also gotten into a trap of journalists, some who really should know better, thinking that both sides deserve this time and shouldn't be challenged with what they're saying.
CNN is doing a lot of that. You know, I've got a theory, and I want to test it on you. I have a sense that part of Trump's rise was facilitated by the death of investigative journalism at a local level. What I mean by that is that the newspapers that people out in the country read were not doing investigative work anymore. And so Trump's lies were being reported as they were without any challenge because there wasn't anybody out investigating and countering what he was saying. Does that make sense to you?
I think it partly makes sense to me. I think you got the local news aspect of it correct. So I think I was not living in this country when local news got gutted. And I wasn't particularly aware of it when I moved back because my local newspaper was the New York Times. But I live in a small town now. And what I've learned since moving to a small town is that local news has been gutted all over the country, just like healthcare has been gutted all over the country. And even veterinary clinics have been gutted as private equity moves in to take over these businesses and either break them up or retire them. So most Americans, I want to say the old days, I don't know how old, like maybe 20 years ago, bought a local paper, whether it was the Southampton Press or the Fauquier Times or whatever it was. They bought their local paper, they read their local paper, and they probably watched evening news or got a national paper as well. And that doesn't exist anymore. Not only do they not have the funds to do investigative work, a lot of these outlets don't exist anymore, Mark. And when they do, they certainly are running on jet fumes. I mean, they are trying to put out these local papers, really doing an incredibly noble job, but struggling for advertising dollars, struggling to pay journalists. So I think that's part of the picture. I think where the ball really has been dropped on investigative journalism is with some of the bigger outlets that probably still could afford to do it. And I don't know why. I'm guessing, we get increasingly more litigious. To your point, these bigger news organizations have been consolidated or are now owned by big corporates who are protecting their interests. So I think at the end of the day, it comes down to money and self-interest at the bigger corporate level. And then just there is nobody running. There's a lot of towns in America don't even have a paper anymore.
It's sad, and it's terribly deleterious to the public interest because people need local news, and they need to know what's going on at a national level because a lot of them don't read the New York Times. They need to see it at their local
Yep,
local newspapers. And so much of local news that I've
I
seen
agree.
traveling around the country is opinion.
Huh,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Well, you need to come spend some time in your backyard in Virginia because there's some really great, I feel like everybody who lives in Fauquier and Rappahannock County used to work for a major, there's so many journalists, retired journalists down here who worked for big newspapers, Miami Herald or Washington Post back in the day. There's great journalism around here. I think it really varies depending on where you are. And I think the emerging model now, which I think is really good, is a nonprofit model for journalism. So if that can
That would be
grow,
great.
and yeah, I agree.
The
It would
reason I
be
raised
great.
the issue was that we travel to Montgomery, Alabama every now and then because my wife's parents live there and she grew up in Montgomery. The local paper, the Montgomery Advertiser, is literally nothing more than a mouthpiece for Trump, both in the news division and in the opinion pages. Everything is
Wow.
shaded toward Trump. And in the
Wow.
opinion pages, it's rabid. You don't have any sense at all that the reality that you live
Hmm.
is being reflected in the way things are being reported or opined on there. And this is replicated all over the South, especially. It's like the Civil War
Mhm.
still being fought.
That I have heard. Well, I'm going to be really careful weighing into that conversation, but I will tell you that I started out life as an agricultural reporter, and somebody sent me something by one of the board members who's board of supervisors who's focused on agriculture. They forwarded an email to me, which I was reading, and this gentleman, he's a really decent guy, but he really was talking about his entitlement to keeping land for farms, which I don't disagree
Yeah.
with, right? And warding off big development. But he went back to the Civil War era and how his ancestors were left with nothing but burned buildings and how they had to make their way. And I was reading this, and then I just wrote back and I just said, does he seems not to have a sense of why the buildings were burned? I mean, they were seditionists. I don't, my kids are English and they were born and raised in London. And sometimes they scratch their head and they say to me, this is the only country that had a civil war that they bent over backwards to be so nice to the seditionists afterwards. I mean, they didn't do that in England or
Yeah.
European
Well, the
countries.
revisionism about the burning of the South is something that's always gotten me. The fact is that a lot of the burning that went on during Sherman's March to the Sea was initiated by John Bell Hood, the Confederate commander of the army that was up against Sherman. And he did it to keep stores and various other things out of Union hands. Sherman's people did burn some things, but a lot of the burning took place at the hands of John Bell Hood and his army. So the whole lost cause thing is just, it's disturbing. It makes me feel like we are not growing as a country at all. We're not growing together. We're growing apart, and that it's been 100+ years and we're still where we were. Maybe, in fact, in some ways worse.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you. And I think what's really, really disturbing is, I like to consider myself pretty decently educated. And I came from a family that encouraged education and reading and as much as I could. I don't know if you've read Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. Did you ever read
Yes.
that book? Okay. When I read it a few years ago, I remember being just gobsmacked at my lack of knowledge about my own country's history. There was so much that I had no idea about. And I fear that given the holes in my own education, which I guess falsely thought was pretty complete, and now an active push to actually redact whole bits of our history, including from the most sacred of
Yeah.
institutions, the Smithsonian. I mean, for people that are already starting out, maybe not having a very comprehensive knowledge of history, what does this look like for not just our generation, but I mean, future generations? And at what point is it not okay to do that? I mean, I don't necessarily trust that the next person who, if we do have a next person who comes to office, is going to accurately reinstate the things that were redacted. There are already holes in all of these stories. So I think we're on really, really dangerous
I agree with you.
ground.
Any final thoughts?
I want to ask you a
Ask
question.
away.
I want to ask you what the First Amendment means to you
As a lawyer, it means
Mm.
the fundamental right to worship as you wish, to be able to report the news as you wish, within reason. I mean, I don't think the First Amendment should have any limits, but I think the truth ought to have limits. And I think that, the First Amendment becomes a dicey proposition when you talk about decoupling Fox News from its license to report things that aren't facts. But the First Amendment means to me the fundamental right, the first right that the framers found to be worthy of placing at the very top of the list of amendments, the right to worship as you wish and to have access to information and to be an informed citizen. I know that's not the most elegant way to put it, but that's just what comes to me.
No, I'm just curious because it comes up a lot as a journalist, and it's coming up all the time now societally. And I'm not a lawyer. And I've always thought about the First Amendment that it's not there to protect press freedom so journalists can be stenographers for bad faith actors. I feel like it's protecting press freedom so that citizens can make informed decisions. But
What
I'm
I
not
was
a
trying
lawyer.
to say.
And I was
What I was
curious
trying to say inartfully. I just had a root canal yesterday, and my brain isn't functioning the way it should. But in any
I'm
case,
sorry.
that's kind of what I was getting at, that it really is for the people. So at the end of the day,
Right.
that's what it means.
And where do we go from
Where
here,
do we go
Mark?
from here? I think the Democrats win back the Congress in 2026 and put a break on this nonsense. And then you get a candidate that can actually win the election, unite behind somebody that has ideas that the public understand and can go with, somebody that speaks to progressives, somebody that'll help bring out the vote, somebody that'll help kill the cynicism and start reversing what's happened. It's going to take a long time to do, but we have to start somewhere. And to do that, we need to elect Democrats in 26 and 28 and then move forward from there. Because as long as the Republican Party, which is really nothing more than a nihilist institution, remains in power, we have no hope of maintaining our democracy.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that. It's scary and depressing. I think we're both parents. I think about my kids and what's happening now is so profound. It's also interesting. I really struggle to call these people Republicans. I don't even know what they are, but they bear I mean, this is not the party of George H.W. Bush. I mean, this is whether you were
My
aligned or
remaining
not,
Republican friends
this
don't know
is
what
a
they are
whole,
either.
your
Yeah,
remaining
they're few and
Republican
far
friends.
between.
Anyway, I so appreciate having the opportunity to chat with you. And I'm so grateful that you are doing what you're doing. And as a lawyer, can shed some wisdom and informed opinion on
You're
what's
very
going
kind. I
on.
try my best.
Take care. Thank you.